Chris Gardner's journey didn't begin in a mansion or a boardroom. It began in a world most people try to escape. Born in 1954 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Chris was raised in a home filled with instability, abuse, and poverty. His stepfather was violent, his mother was in and out of jail, and his early years were marked by trauma and fear. There were no role models around him to show what success looked like. There were no safety nets. He didn't attend Ivy League schools or receive formal business education. In fact, he had no college degree at all. The odds were not just stacked against him, they were buried under layers of racial discrimination, economic hardship, and generational struggle. As a young adult, Gardner tried several jobs, including working in the medical field, hoping to find stability. But even those positions offered little in the way of security or growth. At one point, he invested in medical devices, hoping to sell bone density scanners, but the market was limited, and sales were nearly impossible to close. With no consistent income and mounting responsibilities, things began to spiral out of control. His relationship fell apart, leaving him a single father with no savings and no real prospects. At one of his lowest points, Chris found himself with nothing. No job, no place to live, no financial backing, and a young child relying on him for everything. He didn't just lack money, he lacked basic necessities. There were days when food was uncertain, and nights when safety meant locking the door of a public restroom and hoping no one would knock. Yet, despite the crushing reality of having nothing, no connections, no credentials, no comfort, Chris Gardner still dared to believe that he could create something extraordinary. He understood that starting with nothing didn't mean staying with nothing. But in that moment, nothing was all he had. One of the most defining and heart-wrenching chapters of Chris Gardner's life was not just his battle against poverty, but doing it all while raising a child completely on his own. After his relationship with his partner ended, Chris was left with sole custody of his young son, Christopher Jr., who was only a toddler at the time. Most people in that situation would have handed the child off to someone else or sought state help. But Chris refused. No matter how impossible the situation became, he was determined to remain present in his son's life, not as a weekend visitor, but as a full-time father. What made this decision even more courageous was that he made it at a time when he had virtually nothing. He had no home, no job, and no dependable source of income. Being homeless is devastating. Being homeless with a child is unimaginable. Chris and his son would sleep wherever they could, in shelters when available, in public transportation stations when they weren't. There were nights they curled up in subway station restrooms, locking the door from the inside, as Chris tried to shield his son from the harsh fluorescent lights and the sounds of the world outside. He would use folded jackets as makeshift pillows, holding his son tightly in his arms, trying to offer comfort in the most uncomfortable of places. There were no guarantees, no roadmap, no one to call for help. And yet, every morning, Chris would wake up, prepare his son, and go out in his suit, the same suit, often unwashed, to continue chasing his dream of becoming a stockbroker. He had to time everything perfectly, dropping his son off at daycare, showing up for an unpaid internship where only one person would be hired, then picking up his son in time before the daycare closed, all while racing against the clock to find a bed in a shelter before they were full. His days were exhausting, and his nights were heartbreaking. Yet he kept showing up. Not because he had the luxury to, but because he had no choice. His son was watching. And Chris knew that the example he set during those dark days would shape the man his child would become. That responsibility became his driving force. Chris Gardner's life could have easily been defined by defeat, but instead, it was shaped by his sheer will to keep going. At the heart of his story lies a level of determination that very few people can truly understand. He wasn't just chasing success. He was chasing survival, stability, and the chance to give his son a better future. This was not ambition driven by greed. It was desperation powered by purpose. And once Chris locked in on his goal to become a stockbroker, there was no amount of hardship that could pull him off course. When he first discovered the world of finance, Chris was mesmerized. One day, after seeing a well-dressed man step out of a red Ferrari, he asked him what he did for a living. The man told him he was a stockbroker. That single interaction changed Chris's life. He had no experience, no degree, and no connections in the financial world, but he had the hunger to learn and the courage to try. He began applying for training programs at major brokerage firms, often walking into offices uninvited, handing out resumes, asking questions, chasing leads. Eventually, he landed an unpaid internship at Dean Witter Reynolds, one of the top firms at the time. But there was a catch. Only one intern from the entire program would be offered a paid job at the end. This meant that while everyone else had the comfort of a home, money for transportation, and freedom from worry, Chris had none of that. He was homeless, broke, and raising a child alone. Still, he treated every day like it was the final interview. He made cold calls faster than anyone. He studied harder. He networked smarter. And no one, absolutely no one, knew the pain he was hiding behind his smile and suit. He refused to let his circumstances show. Even on the days when he had no food, when he had to sleep standing up, or when he couldn't afford a phone, Chris kept showing up. His days were filled with rejection, exhaustion, and brutal competition. But where others saw the internship as an opportunity, Chris saw it as his last chance. Failure was not an option. And even though the world was telling him to give up, his internal voice kept saying, "Keep going." What truly set Chris Gardner apart wasn't just his intelligence or work ethic. It was his belief in himself when there was absolutely no visible reason to. At a time when everything in his life seemed to scream, "Give up," Chris chose to believe that his future could be different. That kind of belief is rare. It wasn't based on circumstances or encouragement from others. There were no guarantees, no contracts, no money, no praise. Just a flicker of faith inside him that said, "You were made for something greater." Most people wait for evidence before they believe in themselves. They want the degree, the opportunity, the approval of others, something tangible to cling to. But Chris had none of those. What he did have was an inner compass, a sense of direction that told him to keep moving forward. He believed in his ability to learn, to outwork others, and to push past limitations. He believed that just because he came from nothing didn't mean he was worth nothing. And even when life stripped away every comfort, that belief stayed rooted deep within him. There were days when the doubt was overwhelming, when he couldn't provide food for his son, when he had no idea where they would sleep, when rejection came over and over from clients or hiring managers. But Chris never allowed those moments to define his identity. He didn't see himself as a homeless man. He saw himself as a future stockbroker. He carried himself not as a victim of his past, but as a builder of his future. What made this even more remarkable was that the people around him had no idea what he was going through. He kept his pain private. While others were focused on networking and office politics, Chris was mentally surviving a war zone, and still managing to outperform many of his peers. His belief was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable. It lived in his routine, in how he showed up, and how he kept going even when success seemed impossible. At the core of Chris Gardner's journey lies an extraordinary level of sacrifice, the kind most people wouldn't dare make, especially with a child in tow. For Chris, every single day required choices that tested his endurance, his values, and his humanity. But through it all, he kept his priorities crystal clear. His son came first, no matter the cost. While others chased comfort, Chris was chasing survival. And yet, in the midst of that chaos, he chose to pursue a dream that demanded even more of him. He sacrificed sleep, often staying up late to study financial terms or prepare for the next day of calls. He sacrificed meals, skipping food so his son could eat. There were days when he went hungry, but he never let his child feel that hunger. He gave up every ounce of personal comfort, no warm bed, no privacy, no consistent home, just so his son could feel safe and loved. At night, they would line up at homeless shelters, racing against time and limited space. If there was no room, they'd find a corner somewhere to rest. Once, they ended up sleeping in a locked subway bathroom, Chris cradling his son in his arms, his back against the door to keep strangers out. He cried silently, not from weakness, but from the crushing weight of trying to hold everything together alone. And still, each morning, he got up, put on his one suit, and walked back into the world of high finance with the same intensity as any other intern, perhaps more. He didn't let anyone know that he had slept on a floor or gone without food. His sacrifice was quiet, invisible to those around him, but it was real. Every minute of his day had to be calculated. The timing of daycare drop-offs, the exact moment to arrive at the firm, the mad dash to make shelter before it filled. One misstep meant disaster. Missing a shift, losing a bed, or being seen as unreliable in an industry that had no room for weakness. But he never complained. Because for Chris, it wasn't about what he was losing, it was about what he was protecting. His son was not just his motivation, he was his anchor. Gardner didn't chase success for ego or money. He chased it so his child wouldn't grow up in the cycle of poverty he had endured. That deep-rooted commitment gave his sacrifices meaning. It made every hardship bearable and every small victory monumental. After enduring months of grinding hardship, unrelenting pressure, and invisible suffering, Chris Gardner's breakthrough moment didn't come with fireworks or fanfare, it came in quiet triumph. It was the reward for every sleepless night, every rejection, every moment he chose not to quit. For 6 intense months, Chris had shown up at Dean Witter Reynolds with one singular goal, to be the one person out of dozens of unpaid interns offered a full-time job. And every single day, he fought for that opportunity like his life depended on it, because it did. While his peers had homes to return to, food on their tables, and time to relax after work, Chris was racing the clock from sunrise to sunset. He had to be among the first to arrive and the first to leave, not because he lacked commitment, but because he had to pick up his son from daycare before it closed. He couldn't afford the luxury of networking lunches or after-hours bonding. Every second mattered. Every phone call was made with urgency, every meeting attended with focus, and every challenge handled with precision. He made more calls than others, asked better questions, and took fewer breaks, all while carrying the emotional and physical weight of homelessness and fatherhood. Then, one day it happened. He was called into a room by his supervisors. He didn't know what to expect. He only knew he had given it everything he had. With a few words, they changed the course of his life. He got the job. He had been chosen. Out of a pool of driven, educated, well-connected candidates, Chris Gardner, the homeless single father, the man who slept in bathrooms, the man with no formal background in finance, had proven himself the most capable. That moment was more than a career offer. It was a validation of everything he had endured. It wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. It was proof that his sacrifices weren't in vain, that belief and persistence can win against even the most crushing odds. Chris didn't scream or shout when he got the news. He didn't announce it to the world. He stepped outside, into the sunlight, and clapped quietly to himself with tears in his eyes, a silent release of all the pain, pressure, and weight he had been carrying for so long. It was the first time in a long time he had stood on solid ground, not just physically, but emotionally and financially. The door had finally opened, and Chris was ready to walk through it. Chris Gardner's story didn't end with him getting a job. It was only the beginning of a new chapter driven by deeper meaning. For many, success means wealth, status, or luxury. But for Chris, success was never just about the money. It was about freedom. Freedom from the chains of poverty, from the pain of his childhood, from the fear that his son might experience the same instability he once did. Once he secured a steady job and built a stable foundation, Chris didn't stop. He kept climbing. Not because he was hungry for power, but because he saw his journey as a responsibility. He wanted to prove that someone who had absolutely nothing could build a life of dignity, abundance, and influence, and then use that platform to lift others. Over the years, Chris Gardner transitioned from being a stockbroker to becoming a highly successful entrepreneur. He eventually founded his own brokerage firm, Gardner Rich & Company, with just $10,000 and a small desk. That company would go on to handle multi-million-dollar accounts, placing Chris in the ranks of self-made millionaires. But what makes his success truly extraordinary is that he never forgot where he came from. Despite the sharp suits and boardroom meetings, he remained deeply connected to his roots, always aware of the people sleeping in shelters, the single parents struggling to survive, the children growing up in chaos. Chris began sharing his story, first in schools and community centers, then on global stages. His words inspired millions, not because he spoke like a polished CEO, but because he spoke like someone who had lived through the fire. He wrote a memoir, The Pursuit of Happyness, which became a best-selling book and later a blockbuster film starring Will Smith. But it wasn't about fame. It was about visibility, showing the world that behind every homeless face, there could be a dreamer, a father, a fighter, a future leader. He also invested time and resources into programs for the homeless, for at-risk youth, and for single parents trying to break the cycle of poverty. His success became a tool, not just a trophy, a means to open doors for others. In interviews, speeches, and outreach efforts, he consistently emphasized values like resilience, integrity, and fatherhood. He wanted people to understand that success without purpose is hollow. But when success is built on pain, struggle, and sacrifice, and then used to heal and empower others, it becomes legacy. Chris Gardner's journey is more than a success story. It's a testament to the power of perseverance, the strength of a father's love, and the unshakable belief that no matter how far you fall, you can rise. He didn't let homelessness define him. He didn't let rejection defeat him. And he didn't let hardship break him. Instead, he turned his pain into purpose and his struggle into legacy. Today, Chris Gardner stands not just as a millionaire, but as a mentor, a speaker, and a living symbol of what's possible when you refuse to quit. So if you're facing your darkest hour, remember his story. Because the man who once slept in a subway bathroom is now inspiring the world. And if he can do it, so can you.